Marcus Chen had spent 47 years building an empire. But it took exactly 3 seconds for a 22-year-old server named Emma Rodriguez to watch it all come crashing down as the burgundy liquid arced through the air in what felt like slow motion, splattering across the white silk tie of Heinrich Müller, the German billionaire who held the key to the largest merger in telecommunications history. And in that single frozen moment, Marcus saw not just wine spreading across expensive fabric, but his entire legacy dissolving into a crimson stain that would haunt him for months to come. The private dining room at the Meridian, one of the most exclusive restaurants in all of Manhattan, fell into a silence so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears as Heinrich's face shifted from shock to disgust. And before anyone could move, before anyone could offer apologies or solutions, Marcus did something that would change everything. He turned to the trembling young woman whose silver tray had betrayed her at the worst possible moment, and he unleashed years of pent-up frustration, years of impossible standards, years of measuring human worth in profit margins, and he destroyed her with words sharper than any blade could ever be. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" he hissed, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like ice. "Do you understand that your pathetic incompetence has just cost me $1.4 billion? Are you really this worthless? Or do you have to work at being this catastrophically useless?" Emma stood frozen, her dark eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall, her hands still gripping the now empty tray as if it were a life raft in a storm she never saw coming. And across the table, Heinrich Müller slowly wiped his tie with a napkin, watching not the stain that had ruined his evening, but the man who had just revealed his true character in a moment of crisis. The deal, Marcus would later learn, died not because of the wine, but because of what came next. Heinrich stood, buttoned his jacket, and said simply, "I only do business with men of character, Mr. Chen, and I'm afraid I've just seen yours." And then he walked out of the restaurant, and out of Marcus's life, forever, taking with him not just a merger, but an opportunity that would never come again. Marcus blamed Emma, of course blamed her in that moment, blamed her in the car ride home, blamed her as he poured himself whiskey in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, blamed her as he watched his stock price tumble in the morning news when word got out that the Muller deal had collapsed. He had his assistant file a complaint with the restaurant's management, demanded the girl be fired, insisted that such incompetence should have consequences, and he felt justified in his anger, because surely this was her fault and not his own. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have known in that moment of self-righteous fury, was that Emma Rodriguez had been working 3 jobs for 18 months trying to keep her mother alive, that the tremor in her hands that night wasn't nervousness, but exhaustion from sleeping only 3 hours. Between her shift at the hospital cafeteria and her shift at the Meridian, that the medication keeping Sofia Rodriguez's heart beating cost more than most people's mortgages, and that Emma had just received a call during her break, telling her that her mother's insurance had denied the transplant they'd been hoping for. She'd been distracted. Yes, but she'd been distracted by the kind of grief that turns the world into a blur of sounds and colors that don't quite connect to meaning. And when her elbow caught the edge of the service station at exactly the wrong angle, she had no way of knowing that the domino effect would end with a billionaire's dreams and her own job, the only job that paid enough to matter, slipping through her fingers like the wine that had started it all. 3 weeks later, Marcus sat in his office watching his company's value continue to hemorrhage as investors fled like rats from a sinking ship, and his daughter Lily, whom he hadn't spoken to in 2 years, chose that moment to call for the first time since their explosive argument about his absence from her wedding. "I saw the news," she said, her voice carrying that particular blend of disappointment and reluctant concern that only children can master. "I thought you should know that the internet found that server. Dad, someone recorded the whole thing, and the video went viral." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as Lily continued, explaining that millions of people had now witnessed his cruelty, that commenters were digging into Emma's life and sharing her story, that the hashtag Justice for Emma was trending, and that his name had become synonymous with exactly the kind of heartless corporate greed that the modern world loved to hate. But it was what Lily said next that truly broke through his carefully constructed defenses. "I watched the video, Dad, and I finally understood something I've been trying to figure out for years. I finally understood why you missed my dance recitals and my graduation and my wedding and every moment that mattered. Because I finally saw what you become when something threatens your precious business empire. And I realized that you would have treated me the same way if I had ever gotten in your way." She hung up before he could respond, and Marcus sat alone in an office that suddenly felt like a prison, surrounded by awards and photographs, and all the trappings of success that now seemed as hollow as the man who had earned them. Something shifted in him that night. Not a dramatic conversion, not a road to Damascus moment of enlightenment, but something quieter and more dangerous, the first tiny crack in the foundation of everything he believed about himself. He told himself he was just curious when he asked his assistant to find out more about Emma Rodriguez. Told himself it was just due diligence when he learned about her mother, Sophia, and the denied transplant and the mountain of medical debt. Told himself it was nothing personal when he drove to Queens on a rainy Tuesday evening and parked outside the modest apartment building where Emma had lived her entire life. He didn't know what he expected to see, didn't know what he was looking for, but what he found was Emma herself, sitting on the front steps of the building with her face buried in her hands, and even from across the street he could see her shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs that come from somewhere deeper than tears. Marcus watched for nearly an hour, unable to move, unable to look away, and when Emma's mother appeared in the window above, thin, pale, unmistakably ill, but smiling with such warmth as she waved her daughter inside, Marcus felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in decades, something that might have been shame or might have been the first stirring of something like grace. He started showing up at the hospital where Sophia Rodriguez was being treated. Anonymous donations that funded small comforts, better blankets, access to the hospital's healing garden, sessions with the music therapist who helped patients manage pain without additional medication. He told himself he was simply trying to manage his public image, that this was reputation repair and nothing more. But the truth was more complicated and more terrifying. The truth was that seeing Emma's devotion to her mother, watching her arrive every morning before her remaining job and stay every night until visiting hours ended, witnessing the fierce love that burned in her despite everything she'd lost, something about it had taken root in Marcus's heart, like a seed breaking through concrete. He learned, through careful observation and careful questions to hospital staff who had no idea who he was, that Emma had been accepted to medical school before her mother got sick, that she had given up her dream of becoming a doctor to become a caregiver instead, that she had never once complained or blamed anyone for the hand life had dealt her, and that she still somehow found the energy to comfort other families in the waiting room, to bring coffee to exhausted nurses, to read stories to children in the pediatric ward when she had a few minutes between her mother's treatments. This was who he had called worthless. Marcus realized with growing horror. This was who he had tried to destroy because a glass of wine had fallen on a man who was himself, already looking for a reason to walk away from a deal he'd never truly wanted. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Heinrich Muller had rejected him not because of the spill, but because of the response, which meant that everything Marcus had lost was not Emma's fault at all, but his own, a self-inflicted wound dressed up as someone else's failure. It took him another week to work up the courage to approach her, and when he finally did, waiting outside the hospital on a gray November afternoon, when the first snow of the season was just beginning to fall, Emma looked at him with recognition and something that might have been fear, but might also have been the weary resignation of someone who had run out of energy to be angry. "I know who you are," she said quietly. her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. I know you've been coming to the hospital, and I know about the donations, and I know you probably think this makes things even between us, but it doesn't. Marcus had prepared a speech, had rehearsed apologies and explanations, and carefully constructed sentences designed to minimize his responsibility while still appearing contrite. But standing there in front of this exhausted young woman who should have hated him and somehow didn't, all of his words dissolved like snowflakes on warm pavement. I know it doesn't make things even, he heard himself say, and the voice that came out of him was quieter and more honest than any voice he'd used in 30 years of boardroom battles. I don't think anything could make things even, because what I did to you, what I said to you, wasn't about you at all, and that might actually make it worse. Emma studied his face with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope, and when she finally spoke again, her words cut through every defense he had left. My mother watched the video. Mr. Chen, someone showed it to her, thinking it would upset her. But instead she laughed and said that you reminded her of her own father, who was so afraid of being poor again that he forgot to be rich in the ways that mattered. And she said I should forgive you because anger is too heavy to carry when you're already carrying so much else. Marcus didn't deserve the forgiveness that Emma offered him over the following months. Didn't deserve the way she slowly, cautiously, allowed him to become part of her mother's care team. Didn't deserve the privilege of sitting by Sophia's bedside and hearing stories about the husband who had died when Emma was 12, and the sacrifices they had made to give their daughter a future. But Emma gave him these gifts anyway, not because he had earned them, but because she understood something that Marcus was only beginning to learn, that forgiveness is not about worthiness, but about freedom, and that carrying hatred for people who have wronged us is like drinking poison and expecting them to die. Sofia Rodriguez became, in those strange twilight months, the teacher Marcus had never known. He needed a woman dying by inches, who somehow had more wisdom about living than anyone he had ever met. She told him about her childhood in a small village where everyone looked out for everyone else, about the day she met her husband Miguel at a dance where neither of them knew how to dance but they learned together anyway, about the moment she held newborn Emma and knew that everything she had ever suffered was worth it for this single perfect joy, and about her complete lack of regret for a life that had been difficult but never empty. "You're a smart man, Mr. Chen," she said one afternoon while Emma was getting coffee, and they were alone in the room filled with machines, keeping her alive. "Smart enough to build an empire, smart enough to know when you've made a mistake. But are you smart enough to figure out what you actually want your life to mean?" He didn't have an answer, not then, not for several days afterward, but the question burrowed into him and refused to leave. Meanwhile, his company continued to struggle, and his board of directors was growing restless. And there were whispers of a hostile takeover, enforced resignation, and all the things that would have terrified him 6 months earlier but now seemed strangely distant and almost irrelevant. His daughter Lily called again, this time because she'd heard through mutual friends that her father was spending time at a hospital in Queens instead of fighting for his professional survival. And the conversation was awkward and stilted, but it was a conversation, which was more than they'd had in 2 years. And when Marcus told her about Emma and Sofia, and everything he was learning about what it means to truly live, Lily was quiet for a long moment before saying, "That sounds like a different person than the father I grew up with." Marcus felt tears on his cheeks before he realized he was crying actual tears. The first he'd shed since his own mother's funeral 23 years earlier, and through the phone he heard his daughter beginning to cry too, and something that had been frozen between them for years began, slowly and painfully, to thaw. The end came for Sofia Rodriguez on a Tuesday in February, peaceful and surrounded by love, with Emma holding one hand and Marcus, whom Sofia had taken to calling her accidental son, holding the other. Her last words were addressed to both of them, her voice barely a whisper, but her eyes clear and bright with something that might have been joy. "You found each other," she said. That's the real miracle. Out of all that anger and pain, you found each other. And now you have to take care of each other, because that's what family does." She closed her eyes after that, and her breathing grew softer and slower, and sometime in the quiet hours before dawn she simply stopped, and the monitors sang their mournful song, and Emma collapsed against Marcus's chest with a grief that seemed too large for one person to hold. In the days that followed, Marcus helped Emma navigate the terrible bureaucracy of death forms and the arrangements and the thousands of small decisions that have to be made when you're too broken to decide anything, and he discovered that his money and his connections, which had once been tools for building power, could also be tools for simply making someone's worst days slightly less terrible. He paid for the funeral that Sophia deserved, the one with the musicians playing the songs she had loved and the flowers filling the church with colors that seemed to celebrate rather than mourn. And he stood in the back and watched as dozens of people, whose names he didn't know, came forward to share stories about a woman who had touched their lives in ways, both large and small. And he understood finally that this was wealth, not the number in a bank account, but the number of hearts that break when you're gone. After the funeral, Emma found him standing alone by her mother's grave, and she stood beside him in silence for a long time before speaking. "The hospital called," she said, her voice rough from crying but stronger than he expected. "They said an anonymous donor has fully funded my medical school tuition for the next 4 years, along with a living stipend, so I don't have to work while I study." Marcus kept his eyes on the headstone, but he could feel Emma looking at him. "I'm going to be a doctor," she continued, "just like I always wanted, just like my mother always wanted for me. And I'm going to spend my career helping people who are where we worst cared, and broke, and desperate for someone to care." She took his hand then, a gesture so simple and so profound that it nearly undid him completely. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the money, I mean. Yes, for the money. But more than that, thank you for proving that people can change, that it's never too late to become who you are supposed to be." Marcus finally looked at her, this remarkable young woman who had every reason to hate him and had chosen instead to show him grace, and he shook his head. "I should be thanking you," he said, "because 6 months ago I was the richest man in any room I walked into, and also the most bankrupt. I had everything except anything that mattered, and I didn't even know the difference until a glass of wine showed me who I really was." 1 year later, Marcus stood at the podium of a different kind of conference, not a shareholders' meeting or an industry summit, but the opening ceremony of the Sofia Rodriguez Memorial Clinic, a community health center in Queens that would provide free and low-cost care to families who couldn't afford to be sick. He had sold his company, not in the hostile takeover his board had feared, but in a carefully negotiated deal that preserved jobs and created a foundation with his name on it, a foundation dedicated to exactly this kind of work. His daughter Lily was in the front row, 7 months pregnant with a grandchild he would actually know, a grandchild whose life he would be present for, and beside her sat her husband Robert, who had finally agreed to give his father-in-law a second chance. Emma was at the podium beside Marcus, wearing a white coat for the first time as a newly minted first-year medical student, and when she spoke about her mother and about second chances and about the strange ways that tragedy can become transformation, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Marcus looked out at the crowd, at the community members who had come to celebrate, at the doctors and nurses who had volunteered their expertise, at his daughter and future grandchild, at Emma, who had become the family he didn't know he needed, and he thought about Heinrich Müller's words on that terrible night that had started everything. "I only do business with men of character," the German billionaire had said, and he had been right to walk away, because the man Marcus had been that night had no character worth speaking of. But character, Marcus had learned, was not a fixed quantity, was a choice, made over and over again, in moments both large and small, and it was never too late to start choosing differently. The wine that had spilled that night had destroyed a $1.4 billion deal. Yes, but it had also destroyed something far more important. It had destroyed the illusion that Marcus Chen knew what success actually meant. And from the wreckage of that illusion, something new had grown. Something that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or stock prices. Something that would outlast any empire ever built from money alone. After the ceremony, as the sun set over Queens and painted the new clinic in shades of gold and rose, Emma found Marcus sitting alone on a bench outside, watching families take photos in front of the building that bore her mother's name. "You know," she said, settling beside him, "my mother used to say that God doesn't waste pain. That every hard thing we go through is preparing us to help someone else through something similar." Marcus nodded, remembering Sophia's quiet wisdom, her unshakable faith that meaning could be found in suffering if you looked hard enough. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what she meant," he said. And Emma smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since before her mother's decline. A smile that carried grief and gratitude in equal measure. "So am I," she said. And as the two of them sat there watching the last light of day fade into evening, Marcus realized that he had finally learned the lesson that no business school could teach, no profit margin could provide, and no amount of money could buy. That we are not measured by what we build or what we own, but by what we give away, and that the greatest gift we can offer anyone, including ourselves, is the willingness to become someone better than we were before.